The United States of America may be celebrated as a beacon of democracy and freedom worldwide, yet there's no denying that it's committed some deeply troubling acts. Despite DC's public stance on upholding human rights and adhering to international agreements, looking at you, Don, the very rights that the US claims to champion have often been violated in the quest for military victory. Even more troubling is the fact that these actions were frequently concealed from the public. When you peel back the curtain, you uncover a mountain of war crimes built on the suffering of millions of innocent people. Some of these crimes are among the most egregious in history, while others have occurred in relatively recent conflicts. Every nation has its skeletons, and now it's time to expose some of Uncle Sam's. Alright, look, before we start accusing the US military of war crimes, it is important to understand what a war crime is. If you're not familiar with the subject, we've got a whole video all about how war crimes work, and it delves into that really deeply, but in short, a war crime is a grave violation of the Geneva Conventions during wartime. The term also serves as a catch-all for various violations of these conventions. It includes acts like torture, killing unarmed non-combatants, pillaging, assault, and other heinous crimes. Interestingly, the US tends to follow its own rules when it comes to international law, though it generally aligns with the practices of most other countries. For instance, the US has not fully ratified the entire Geneva Conventions, nor has it ratified the global ban on landmines. Yet, in their policies, they usually adhere to the international norms concerning both of these issues. So, on what occasions has the US really stepped out of line, causing suffering and death with innocent people? Let's get into it. Oh, just before we do understand that not every member of the US military or every American is a war criminal. That would be insane. We're just trying to head off the comments at the pass. We also recognize that other countries around the world have also committed significant war crimes. However, that's not what we're talking about in today's video, so let's carry on. Many people today believe that the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, also known as North Korea, harbors a deep animosity toward the United States because of the latter's celebration of freedom and its individualistic way of life. It's commonly assumed that this stance is in direct opposition to the Kim regime's lineage of revered leaders who are treated almost like gods while the rest of the population endures severe abuses. Although there is some truth to this contrast, the two countries indeed differ starkly in their rights afforded to their citizens, many tend to overlook some of the astonishing war crimes the United States has committed against North Korea throughout history. The reality is that such cultural trauma is not easily forgotten, even if North Korea was always destined to follow the path that it has. During the Korean War, which began only 1 year after the fourth signing of the Geneva Convention in 1950, the United States burned North Korea to the ground. The brief conflict, lasting just 3 years, saw the United States Air Force drop over 100,000 tons more ordnance on North Korea than was dropped throughout the entire Pacific theater of World War II. The destruction was so monumental that, according to Time, bombers spent most of their flight miles merely searching for targets. By 1953, the average building in North Korea was about a foot tall. Dean Rusk, the State Department's official in charge of East Asia at the time, stated that the US planes bombed, quote, everything that moved in North Korea, every brick standing on top of another. This act stands as a war crime in itself, carried out under the pretense of proportionality and indiscriminate targeting. 22 North Korean cities were completely leveled. Furthermore, 32,000 of the more than 600,000 tons of explosives dropped on the Hermit Kingdom in just 3 years were in the form of napalm, the flammable jelly substance that a decade and a half later burned down half of Vietnam. While using napalm is not considered a war crime when it targets military personnel, it unquestionably becomes one when it's aimed at civilians. If you drop 32,000 tons of any kind of weapon on a country, you're almost guaranteed to hit civilians. Yet the US didn't just hit 1 or 2 individuals. It's estimated that 282,000 North Koreans died solely as a result of the US bombing campaign. In total, between 2 and 3 million North Koreans would later perish due to starvation or exposure caused by the bombings in a nation where the population in 1950 was only 10 million. General Curtis LeMay, who led the Strategic Air Command, later boasted to Air Force historians that, quoting him here, over a period of around 3 years, we wiped out what? 20% of North Korea's population as direct casualties of war or through starvation and exposure. End quote. By sheer numbers, that means almost everyone in North Korea today is either descended from or knows someone who lost their life during that time. So yeah, definitely the freedom they despise. Right? As far as we understand, no one was ever held accountable for the destruction of North Korea, and it's unlikely that anyone ever will be. Where do you even begin with Vietnam? US forces were active both on the ground and in the air over this communist nation, engaging the Viet Cong for an extended period. Over the course of the conflict, a vast range of American-perpetrated war crimes occurred, from isolated killings of civilians falsely claimed to be Viet Cong to full-blown massacres and indiscriminate bombing of civilian populations. Now, we've already previously discussed the use of napalm in the Korea section, and numerous photographs documenting its use have circulated widely. You may well be familiar with the infamous image of a naked girl whose clothes were burned off while her skin peeled away. We're not going to display that photo here, but what we can tell you is that she wasn't an enemy combatant. In terms of specific moments where war crimes were committed, one might begin with the most infamous US war crime in Vietnam, the My Lai Massacre. On the morning of March 16, 1968, Lieutenant Frank A. Barker and his unit were airlifted to a small Vietnamese village called Song My, which was at that time known as My Lai. Their mission was to capture or kill Viet Cong members and sympathizers. Barker's unit had been informed that most of the civilians in Song My would be away at the local market, but this turned out not to be the case. While incorrect intel can occur during war, what is unacceptable are Barker's orders to his GIs to burn houses, kill livestock, destroy foodstuffs, and close wells. As the soldiers entered the village, the unit indiscriminately massacred men, women, children, and the elderly. They encountered no resistance as they butchered the residents of the village and its surrounding areas. Those not killed on the spot were herded into nearby ditches and executed by shooting. They fired into houses and threw demolitions into shelters without even verifying whether anyone was inside. Many died, almost all civilians, and numerous individuals were raped by US soldiers before they died. In total, between 500 and 700 Vietnamese civilians were slaughtered and brutalized for no other reason than simply being present. This was a war crime in every sense of the word. After the unit returned, with one KIA and several wounded from booby traps in the area, Colonel Orrin K. Henderson was assigned to investigate the massacre. And by investigate, we mean he tried to cover the whole thing up and suppress the truth. But in the end, the facts emerged. Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson Jr., who was present and refused to kill any civilians, later stated that not only did the US top brass work hard to cover their tracks, but that he was also ostracized for blowing the whistle on the massacre. In his own words, quote, "After it broke in the United States, I was not a good guy. I was sure not being invited to Annapolis or West Point or any other university that I've been to since, because I was a traitor, I was a communist, I was a sympathizer. I was neither one of those." Those who spoke out against the massacre were eventually rewarded for their bravery, while the vast majority of those who committed the atrocities escaped significant justice. Some died before they could be court-martialed, while others received lengthy prison sentences only to be pardoned early in their terms. Many were acquitted, and numerous charges were dropped, including those against Colonel Henderson. Although public apologies have been issued for the My Lai massacre, true justice was largely never served. Today, a memorial stands in Vietnam at the site where the atrocity happened. My Lai might be the most famous massacre of Vietnam, but it was by no means the only one. In the 1960s, the Mekong Delta served not only as a stronghold for the Viet Cong, but also as home to 6 million Vietnamese civilians. By the late 1960s, peace talks had begun, yet the Americans were still aggressively working to solidify their position at the negotiating table. American commanders aimed to pacify the Delta and eliminate entrenched Viet Cong fighters, which led to the authorization of free fire zones. These zones were effectively areas where US forces were allowed to fire on anything that moved within a specified perimeter. The underlying idea was that by clearing out the civilians, anyone remaining would be a North Vietnamese combatant and therefore fair game. This tactic was intended as a countermeasure to the Viet Cong's guerrilla strategy of hiding among civilian populations. However, there was a problem. The US either wouldn't or couldn't actually clear the civilians, especially considering that the Delta was a Viet Cong stronghold. And even if they managed to clear the area, one has to ask, where were the residents supposed to go once their village had been burned to the ground? But nonetheless, the US 9th Division struck hard and fast using military gunships, bombing raids, and artillery fire. Generals and commanders alike were fixated on ensuring high body counts even if the victims were non-combatants. Soldiers and pilots received orders to shoot Vietnamese civilians who were fleeing, and later those involved described a campaign of utterly indiscriminate killing with vast swaths of land obliterated. This continued for over a year. One concerned soldier who attempted to blow the whistle on the operation wrote in a letter to command that if his numbers were correct, it was equivalent to more than a My Lai every month for over a year. Operation Speedy Express reportedly claimed a body count of over 11,000 individuals. Despite the Mekong being a stronghold for the Viet Cong and guerrilla fighters traditionally being well armed, only 748 weapons were captured, indicating that the vast majority of those killed were in fact, civilians. But the top brass in the US military covered it up, fearing a public backlash at a time when the war was growing increasingly unpopular. Eventually, journalist Nick Turse uncovered the concerned soldier's letter in a long-forgotten archive in the early 2000s, sparking an investigation that ultimately exposed Operation Speedy Express and the mass casualties it caused. Not a single 9th Division soldier or commander has ever been court-martialed for their role in the operation, let alone tried for war crimes, leaving the families of the Vietnamese victims without justice for generations. Jumping forward a few decades, the War on Terror has witnessed multiple crimes committed by American soldiers and operatives. While the rules of war remain hazy when it comes to terrorists, especially in Iraq and Afghanistan, where many operate as guerrilla fighters, those who do not identify themselves as combatants, for example by wearing a uniform, are considered exempt from the standard rules of war and can thus be freely targeted. However, the fog of war makes these judgment calls pretty damn murky. What's the difference between a civilian and a guerrilla terrorist dressed in civilian clothing who's unarmed? At times, it's almost impossible to tell, but that's not the central issue here. Even if the US believes it does not have a moral duty to refrain from committing acts that some might label as war crimes against terrorists, it absolutely has a moral responsibility to avoid doing so to innocent civilians. And in some instances, the distinction is very clear. These war crimes took the form of 3 separate massacres of innocent people. The first incident wasn't even carried out by the US military. It was perpetrated by a well-known American private military contractor called Blackwater. It happened in 2007. At the time, the surge of coalition forces in Iraq was well underway, which included many PMCs working for or with the US military. On September 16, 2007, armed American trucks entered Nisour Square in the heart of Iraq's capital, Baghdad. Blackwater guards were escorting a State Department convoy through the square when insurgents ambushed them. During the ensuing 20-minute gunfight, 17 innocent Iraqis were killed and many others were wounded. Later investigations found out that some victims had been shot in the back as they tried to flee. The case bounced around the courts for some time. Some blamed the government's reckless approach, while others pointed out that even with the surprise of an ambush and with PMCs like Blackwater cleared to defend themselves in cases of immediate danger, the 17 dead, countless wounded, and telltale bullets in the backs undermined their credibility, fueling the narrative that they were poorly trained for insurgent combat. 4 guards from the PMC were eventually indicted and convicted in 2014 on charges including murder, manslaughter, and various weapons offenses. In 2024, however, they were pardoned by President Trump. And this wasn't the first massacre of the Iraq War. Back in 2005, while Staff Sergeant Frank Wuterich was moving with his unit through Haditha, a roadside bomb killed one of his fellow Marines. In the heat of the moment, Wuterich went into a frenzy, ordering his squad to shoot first and ask questions later. The 8-man Marine squad rampaged into Haditha on Wuterich's orders, blasting anyone who stood in their way. They fired into houses and lobbed grenades even when no enemy combatants were reported to be present. By the end, 24 innocent Iraqi civilians lay dead, 10 of them women and children, and 1 man who was confined to a wheelchair. One soldier, Sergeant Sanig de la Cruz, who would later be granted immunity in exchange for his testimony, revealed that he had urinated on the dead at Haditha following the massacre. While every Marine initially faced charges over the incident, only Wuterich eventually saw his case culminate in a conviction. Of the 7 others charged, 1 was acquitted, and the charges against the remaining 6 were entirely dropped. In contrast, Wuterich faced 9 counts of manslaughter, a conviction that would result in a long prison sentence. Except that's not what happened. In January of 2012, he was found guilty of a single count of negligent dereliction of duty, a conviction that resulted in no jail time whatsoever. And you probably don't need me to say that it sounds like an incredibly lenient thing for inciting a massacre that killed 24 people. Yet some believe Wuterich was covering for senior leaders and more seasoned combat veterans in his squad when he took the fall. It was, after all, his first time in combat. Despite the alleged fear of harboring insurgents, no such threat existed, and as a result, 24 innocent lives were lost, including those of women, children, and the disabled. Another man who seemed to have snapped under the pressure was Sergeant Robert Bales. Having served 3 tours in Afghanistan, on March 11, 2012, he seemingly went rogue in the middle of the night and opened fire on 2 villages in Kandahar province, killing 16 people. The story becomes murky from that point on. Some say he left on foot, although traversing the several kilometers between the 2 villages would not have allowed him to return to the base between his attacks, as was reported. Others claim he was accompanied by a group, while some insist he acted alone. What we do know is that Bales went door to door, trying each door, and if it was unlocked, he would enter and kill everyone inside using his pistol, rifle, and grenade launcher before burning some of the bodies. Upon returning to base, He simply said, "I did it." But the people of the villages and the families of those murdered in cold blood, 9 of whom were children with 6 others wounded, were angry for different reasons. Some were incensed because they had wanted Bales to receive the death penalty, yet he ended up with a sentence of life without parole in the United States after accepting a plea deal. Other village elders were furious because they believed the US government had covered up the real perpetrators of the attack, insisting that it was not just one man, but 20 soldiers operating from 2 helicopters. Meanwhile, some community members were convinced they heard walkie-talkie chatter before the attack, a detail that would have been impossible if only one person was responsible. We may never know what truly happened, but the US military has its story, and they're sticking to it. But there is nothing that compares, when discussing crimes committed during the War on Terror, to the use of the Abu Ghraib detention facility. Originally, it was a derelict Iraqi prison used by the Saddam regime to disappear those it targeted. When Saddam fell, the United States took over the prison for its own use. By 2004, the US had confined several thousand Iraqis there, broadly classified into 3 groups: common criminals, security detainees suspected of crimes against the coalition, and a small number of suspected high-value insurgency leaders. In reality, most of those held inside were civilians. It's not only the arbitrary detention in the name of security that made Abu Ghraib infamous. It was also the psychotic and sadistic regime of torture and human rights abuses perpetrated there. Originally published in The New Yorker by investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, who also uncovered the story of the My Lai massacre, many of the photos have likely already reached you. One such image shows a hooded man hooked up to electrodes and standing on a box, with the clear threat that if he stepped off, he would be electrocuted. There are many more pictures, many of which we just can't show due to YouTube's policies, but they're available if you wish to search them for yourself, but we wouldn't recommend it. Prisoners were beaten while handcuffed, bent over railings and cuffed to bars. They were hooded, stripped naked, and forced into humiliating positions, such as sitting on another's shoulders, simulating oral sex, or being arranged in a human pyramid. Some were knelt upon, others were covered with feces or shoved into corners while attack dogs snapped just inches from their skin. Others were bitten and were forced to remain naked around female soldiers. One was even put on a leash. Throughout the prison, both male and female prisoners were brutally raped. The Washington Post later revealed that in addition to these abuses, methods such as sleep deprivation, temperature extreme, sensory deprivation, and more were used as form of torture inside the prison. And that's not even all of it. But you get the idea. Pictures of the worst crimes have actually not been released, and many of these techniques are reportedly still in use at the US detention site in Guantanamo Bay. The authorization for these enhanced interrogation techniques, as the Bush administration called them, came through an executive order issued by President Bush himself, as well as from orders by Ricardo Sanchez, the senior US military officer in Iraq, and by then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. Some individuals died as a result of their abuse. However, the most disturbing aspect of the photographic evidence is that US soldiers appeared elated to have their pictures taken while torturing people. Many struck deliberate poses, snapping photos with grins next to dead bodies, and they seemed to overwhelmingly enjoy the experience of inflicting cruel abuse on innocent individuals. Many officers and soldiers were eventually either discharged from the US military, served only a short sentence in a military prison, or were acquitted. The sad reality, however, is that none of them received a prison term that truly reflected the gravity of their actions. Donald Rumsfeld asked to resign twice over Abu Ghraib, and President Bush denied both requests. In essence, none of the top brass were held fully accountable for these war crimes. In 2024, one private military contractor was forced to pay $42 million to 3 plaintiffs who were tortured at the prison's hard site where most of the worst abuses took place. This money can't restore justice for the victims or bring back those who were tortured to death at the hands of the Bush administration. It's widely believed that over 90% of those detained in Abu Ghraib were completely innocent, and even if 100% of them had been guilty, it would still not justify what occurred there. Now, there are many examples of war crimes committed by American soldiers while on duty. There are likely even more that we've yet to cover. What makes these crimes, along with others we haven't mentioned, so disturbing is that in the vast majority of cases, no one was ever held truly accountable. Some of the most horrific crimes imaginable were perpetrated against the most vulnerable, and the US government, along with its military branches, either covered them up or issued only a slap on the wrist. As a result, the victims and their families never saw any real justice for their worlds being shattered by a hail of gunfire, bombs, and torture. And for what? Orders? Duty? Honor? Now, you can't paint the whole US military with the same brush. And there are bad apples in every orchard. Yet, as the saying goes, one bad apple spoils the bunch. And for those in these countries who have had to interact with the US military, that's exactly what has happened. The bunch was spoiled, and the well was poisoned, leading people to view all American soldiers, rightly or wrongly, as capable of committing the same abuses. This perception is only reinforced by the fact that the perpetrators have faced no consequences proportional to the astonishing suffering inflicted on innocent people. The USA has a long way to go to repair these wounds. Thank you for watching.